We are the CSPARC team, which is the Commonwealth Sustainable Procurement Advocacy and Resource Centre. We sit within the Circular Economy Division within Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water at the federal level. And we were established mid-2020, and we had a very strong recycled content focus. So that was linking back to the National Waste Policy Action Plan and targets in that to increase industry and government use of recycled content. So we have been working across the APS, but also with industry, with groups like the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, working with Infrastructure Australia on their market capacity report, looking at those opportunities for recycled content. But obviously, as we had the change in government and we had new policies coming up around moving to a circular economy, net zero commitments within the APS, we were really keen to get a policy in place that prioritised environmental sustainability in procurement, but also didn't just focus on recycled content. It was covering and linking to those broader policy agendas. So with that, I will hand over to Lynn and Gail.
Thanks, Kath. I think Gail's going to share the slides.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for you to pop up, and I will take over to do that.
Thanks, Gail. On to the next slide, I think. So I'll just give you an overview of the policy, and then Gail will go into the details. So just flick through to the three. Thanks, Gail. So the policy aims to establish a reporting framework to monitor and track the progress. It aims to stimulate industry investment and innovation in environmentally sustainable goods and services by generating demand at scale. And just to give you some idea, as government procurement is about 15 to 17% of GDP globally and in Australia as well. And it aims to support Australia's initiatives and strategies, as Kath mentioned, towards net zero and the circular economy. Okay, on to the next one. So the policy is intended to support this shift, and it does this by mandating climate, environment and circularity requirements in Australian government procurements. So our spend profile guided the decisions on which categories to target. This was informed by international research. It also targets categories with the highest environmental impact and where credible schemes are in place to support the verification and mitigate greenwashing. So the majority of Australian, interesting to note, this majority of Australian government procurements for services, about 63%, but this also includes service providers that provide goods to us. And I think I saw Yanni on the group, and I've been dealing with Yanni, who is a service provider. So the policy is in 4 of these high impact categories, and we've kicked off with construction services on the 1st of July, and they have to be projects over the 7.5 million threshold. And then next July, we'll kick off with the remaining phase 2 ones, ICT, textiles and furniture, fittings and equipment, procurements over 1 million. On to the next one. Thanks, Gail. So we've got 3 focus areas. It's environmental sustainability targets, and these are climate, environment and circularity. So Australian government procurers and their suppliers are required to achieve and demonstrate climate, environment and circularity outcomes in their procurements by applying the principles that you see listed under each of those focus areas. So the policy allows flexibility of which principles can be chosen by suppliers, but reporting requirements mean that they must report on low emissions materials, waste diverted for recycling and recycled content used. Okay, and over to Gail.
Thanks, Lynn. Just go back to that one. So as Lynn mentioned, we have, I think there are 14 sustainability principles that we are focusing on in those 3 focus areas. And while one of them is low embodied emissions materials, it's of course not the only one that affects the embodied carbon of a project. So we're looking at, using less, using maybe renewable inputs, and of course having refurbished or recycled content as options. And so that, embodied carbon sort of crosses all of those principles. So I just wanted to call that out. It's quite broad. And yeah, of course, that there are a couple of the ones that they also have a longer life. As Lynn pointed out, so there's a couple of stages to our policy. The first is that we're asking all tenderers to put in a supplier environmental sustainability plan, for which we have a template where we're asking them to demonstrate how their project is going to be sustainable across those principles. And it was talked about earlier, the innovation question. And so that's certainly something we're also asking about, is what innovations are you bringing to this project to improve sustainability? So once they've demonstrated that there's a supplier environmental sustainability plan is part of their tender, it'll be assessed as part of the tender assessment process. And then the winning supplier is required to report against those couple of things. So while the policy is quite broad, for the construction services, we're really focusing on the embodied carbon materials, recycled content materials, and the waste recovery, and then, of course, the innovation. We really wanted to encourage everyone to get a Green Star or IS rating, and so that's certainly our preference. If they get a Green Star rating, then there's no further reporting to us, and then there's another sort of option B where they could get a neighbours 4-star rating, now that that's delightfully introduced to align with our policy. And if they don't do that, then they have to report on the proportion of materials that are low embodied carbon. And so if they get a Green Star, we have asked that they go down the climate positive pathway. They can get a 4-star, and rather than the higher ones at this stage, and that aligns with the current net zero in government operations strategy, which also requires a climate positive pathway for projects over $15 million from 2026. So this is aligned, but a little bit a couple of years early. So that climate positive pathway requires 20% reduction in upfront embodied carbon. If it's an infrastructure project and they go down the path of infrastructure sustainability rating, it's not certain, it's not mandatory to have low embodied carbon materials. They can, of course, get a rating without using that RS06 material life cycle. We are working with ISE in future, there may be a way to define how we get low embodied carbon materials as a sort of a mandatory pathway. The other option, if they don't go down that rating tool, is that they report their base metrics and if they can get a neighbours rating, and again, that's a 4-star rating that we would encourage. And if they don't do that, then we want them to report their low embodied carbon materials. We have defined low embodied carbon materials with respect to that neighbours database. They have, as part of their rating tool, they've got a database across a whole lot of materials. I'm sure you're all aware. And they have defined an industry average global warming potential for that category of material, whether that's, particular concrete strength or glass or aluminium, etc. And so we have defined that if it's lower than that neighbours industry average, then we are calling it low embodied carbon. And we ask them to report positively. So we're just asking them to report the materials that are low, and we're asking them to give us the global warming potential of that. So we're looking at the modules A1 to A3 that, you're talking about that earlier today, and that's by the fossil plus the land use change carbon. And I can see your hand up, but I can't see anyone.
That's all right. Just two quick questions. If you're using the base metrics option, do you have to report what proportion of your embodied carbon those lower embodied carbon materials account for? Like, if you're I'm working through a scenario where if you had chosen a very small proportion of the building's footprint that you were trying to lower, like, does that need to be transparently disclosed?
The value of those materials. And so we've asked for the total material value. And so
right.
If only 1% of you, so if you're putting in, we've got some low embodied carbon concrete and you're putting in those values, it will show that it's in fact only 1%
of your overall.
The overall, yeah.
And
because we're only
asking
for the positive ones.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that allows you to see whether it's how significant that contribution is, which I think is important.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm interested in your view on, the Green Star tool allows a net zero kind of approach to embodied carbon reduction, where they do allow for currently you to include offsets. So if a supplier of steel has offsets their product manufacturing, that they count that. Well, I don't think the Neighbours tool does that. I think the Neighbours tool might be absolute. We certainly, as a MECLA, have always been really trying to push for an absolute reduction, because ultimately that's what changes manufacturing, rather than suppliers investing money in offsets. We prefer they invest money in R&D. So I just wondered whether, as a government, you had a view on that, and whether there was a preference for what you were hoping to encourage.
So looking at the broader picture, we, following that lead of net zero and government operations, we're wanting to encourage governments to go down that Green Star path, noting that it isn't perfect, but it's certainly better in many ways than we are already delivering. And yes, I understand that the Neighbours doesn't allow for offsets.
It just might be at some point you might flip it, because the Neighbours tool might actually be being able to push the industry further, faster, possibly.
Yeah, but I guess the Green Star is much more holistic and covers
it is. It's a great
other
tool.
Sustainability principles as well, and so that's why we're pushing in that direction.
It gives you other benefits.
I think the other thing is because the Neighbours embodied carbon rating tool, when we were announcing the policy, wasn't like it wasn't out there, and people didn't really know about it. So I think it was sort of cart before the horse. We were just obviously the Green Star's got the holistic approach, but we wanted the Neighbours tool in there, so we've built it in, but it was just a timing thing at that point in time.
Thanks.
So I'll just quickly show an extract of our reporting spreadsheet that we're asking with regard to reporting the materials that are recycled and or low embodied carbon. So we've allowed for a drop-down menu of different categories that aligned with the categories that Neighbours do use. And so we've asked them to select that category, and then to enter in the global warming potential, the fossil plus the LULUC. Oh, sorry, I have clicked my mouse. And then we'll compare that. So they put in their EPD amount of global warming potential, and then the spreadsheet will pop up the Neighbours average, and we can sort of see there has been some improvement in that. And so that's sort of a quick overview of what we're looking at there. The other thing I wanted to touch on is that we did a cost benefit analysis for this policy. It was part of the formal impact analysis that we were required to do by Prime Minister and Cabinet. And so that cost benefit analysis, it really hinged on the value of embodied carbon, and that's particularly in the construction services stage. I keep touching my mouse. So if you would like to bear with me for a minute, if you're interested, I can sort of go through that CBA process and how we did that maths. Are you happy for another few minutes to talk about this?
Sure.
Okay, so we identified the costs to do with the policy, that the costs associated, with DQ administering and the policy, supporting suppliers and government agencies, the training, the reporting, and also what was included was a potential green premium cost, and that is the idea that in many cases sustainability option may be more expensive than the base alternative. And then we looked at the benefits, and sort of to make my life easier, we divided it into 3 types of benefits. The first one was ones where the benefit happened at or before the procurement and we could monetize it. And so that was the cost to the APS of that, the green premium. And very conveniently, they balanced out. So I didn't actually have to consider them much any further because the green premium cost was actually the same as the green premium revenue on the other side of the spreadsheet. But the big one there was that we could evaluate the embodied carbon reduction in the construction stage. And then we had the type 2 benefits, which were also able to be monetised, but was sort of happened after the procurement. So they were ongoing. That's the operational savings from more energy efficiency and operational carbon reduction. And then the type 3, which were very difficult to monetise, and they're the environmental benefits, so other climate benefits, so the embodied carbon of the other categories we didn't even look at, and then the benefits to reputation, confidence to suppliers, industry innovation, and health, increase in jobs. So luckily I didn't have to work out how to account for all of those because the embodied carbon piece was really quite large. And so to do that maths, we really relied on the Infrastructure Australia report, which has only come out recently, the embodied carbon projections for Australian infrastructure and buildings, but it was released in draft form late last year. So we relied on that report, and I've sort of extrapolated from there, where at the time they've said that there could be a 23% reduction in embodied carbon at no cost by 2027, and that report was sort of looking at $116 billion of infrastructure pipeline work, and that in total emitted 37 million tonnes of carbon. So I've sort of extrapolated that to say, well, maybe let's assume we can do half that. We can do half as good as that report says we can. And that maths from the sort of worked out as on average, each project was emitting 318 tonnes of carbon per $1 million of project.
There's a question on average, in the chat about that too. Was the embodied
Do you want to read it out?
carbon-
I can't see.
Yeah, it was the embodied carbon reduction in what was the embodied carbon in reduction in what was the embodied carbon reduction in construction based on design only or design and supply?
So I have just used the Infrastructure Australia report, which was really only a replacement for materials. So no, we didn't look at the benefits in design. We just looked at the opportunities in a like-for-like replacement. So it was fairly conservative in that sense. And so we've anyway, the short story was that we worked out we could potentially save 100,000 tonnes of carbon, and there was a government carbon price that is used for by the infrastructure and transport ministers, and that was $60 per tonne. So essentially it was potentially $6 million worth of carbon we could save just by that simple like-for-like replacement. So altogether, we found that the policy would cost $4.3 million per year to implement, but we could save $6 million on embodied carbon and another 280,000, not dollars, on electricity, and then the uncosted benefits that I talked about. So
funny that we don't, it's funny that we don't talk about the thing that actually will save life on Earth.
Yeah, right. Like,
yeah, frustrating that we don't get.
So yeah, we just won't mention that. But yes. Any questions for the team?
A broader question of, has anyone done work on that last part?
Yeah.
There is the detail, but if you want the detail of the cost benefit analysis, you can go to the Office of Impact Analysis and have a look at it.